If worldwide affairs have a place in your day, this is the place you will want to stay. The Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast with your host, world-renowned voice of Garvey and global news commentator, Ron Bobb-Semple.
Greetings and welcome to the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast. We will be addressing global issues that impact our day-to-day lives.
The bourgeoisie is fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason. The capitalists know far better than the progressives seem to know that once Negro women undertake action, the militancy of the whole Negro people, and thus the anti-imperialist coalition, is greatly enhanced. Those are the words of Claudia Jones, who created the London Carnival in 1959. Joining us to talk about this phenomenal woman is Caribbean-American professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University, Carole Boyce Davies. Greetings and welcome to the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast.
Hi, Ron. What a pleasure talking with you always about anything Caribbean, which I know you represent always. Also about this love of ours, the fact that we have a more expansive understanding of Claudia Jones.
Absolutely. You are the author of the prize-winning book, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Claudia Jones. Tell us about Claudia Jones. She was a true woman to her people, wasn't she?
Oh my goodness, yes. For Claudia, often I want like an entry point because with her, I could go in so many directions. What I will do is, first of all, say who she was. And basically, this is a woman who was born in Trinidad. And that is probably one of the reasons why I was interested in her, because as I have said in other places, in the process of studying Caribbean women writers and getting more and more understanding of the range of women who have been writing creatively in the Caribbean, I also felt that there was a kind of gap, knowledge gap, in terms of the women who were also contributing at the political, intellectual, ideological level. And so you can imagine finding Claudia Jones was then something that was like a gold mine, a gold find, because here she was. Here is one of those people who had somehow escaped full recognition and understanding. And I say full because there are pockets of places where people knew who she was. But really to have her be known by the Caribbean community in the international sense and be recognized even broader than that for her contributions to a range of fields is where I feel the additional work that I did on her has been able to have that kind of knowledge gap filled. So I still a quest because each time I find out more information, for example, I have a friend who is working on another project completely, and she discovered a poem that Andrew Salke wrote on Claudia called Clear-Sightedness. And she sent it to me. She said, "Have you seen this?" I was like, "No." So basically, it's something that if I write something else that is fully, I still write all the time about her, but if I write something more thoroughly engaged on her in a different angle, I could also use again. So Trinidadian by birth, but the reason why I think she falls out of full recognition is that the series of migratory patterns which she experienced. And there you go. That's the question, isn't it? That Caribbeans already diasporized, according to Stuart Hall, because we are people who were brought from other places, Africa, India, Asia, and other locations to the Caribbean, definitely European scheme as well. And then from there migrated again. So for Stuart Hall, it's like doubly and then triply diasporized. So she was technically triply diasporized because as a little girl, 8 years old, with her family in 1924 to Harlem, New York, and don't think Harlem as it is today at all, or even as it was, a few years ago when it was very much a Black community. Now it's been so gentrified. But even back then, it was more like difficult living, slum living, hard living, and so on. And her father was a super in a building. So they lived in a basement. And she said it was often cold. She got sick, all those kinds of issues that Black people face. So the first migration then for her as a little girl of 8 to the United States, to Harlem, and then she goes to elementary school there and middle school and high school. And then she migrates again towards the end of her life to England, to the UK, following a very difficult experience, which we can get into more as we go forward with our conversation.
You were also born in Trinidad. What is it about Claudia Jones that really took a hold of Carole Boyce Davies?
Oh, wow. Well, this the reason why I said earlier that she was known by pockets of people. I was in London in 1985. I used to teach at the State University of New York, Binghamton. And with that program, that university, there was a London study abroad program. And for 1 or 2 or 3 years, I was the co-director of it. One of the first times that I was able to do that, I ran into Buzz Johnson. Buzz Johnson, unfortunately, has passed. His son is an amazing journalist. I need to just add, Amanda Thomas Johnson. But Buzz Johnson had created a small press called Carrier Press, K-A-R-I-A Press. And when I met him, it was in those days, of course, tells you how old I am. It was in the late 80s. And I say that because now when you talk to students and you tell them 80s, some of them weren't even born in the 80s. I feel like embarrassing, okay? Some of them were born actually after the World Trade Center blew up. So they don't even know that. Anyway, so in 1988 or something like that, I met Buzz Johnson, and Buzz Johnson had a little book in his hand, and the title was, I Think of My Mother, Notes on the Life and Times of Claudia Jones. I think of my mother in quotes. And in those days, many of us were like very pro-Black consciousness and feminist and all of that. And he said, well, y'all talking a lot about feminists, but this is somebody you need to know. So I bought the book from him, and it was, it's a book that stayed on my shelf for a number of years. And then each time I would go back to it, because I would often find some things that she said, like the opening that you read earlier, that was so relevant to my own teaching or my own writing. So I had bits and pieces of it. But it was when I went back to England subsequently, trying to find more material on her for a lecture I was supposed to do, I discovered there was not a lot of material available. So I began to interview different people. And many of them would hand me things. They'd be like, I'm so happy that you're doing this. She was so amazing. One woman I met named Ranjana Ash took me to lunch at one of those really nice London women's clubs, restaurants. And she was in tears saying, I'm so glad somebody is working on her. And the reason why I say that is that for the United States government, the idea was for her not to be known. So she was actively a member of the Communist Party, which she joined when she was 18, the Young Communist League, and then fully in the Communist Party when she was 21. So she was part of a group of Black left feminist women who were already consciously thinking of the intersections of race, class, and gender, and how women's rights, then workers' rights, and Black people's rights come together in that context. And the reason why this is critical, people think of Angela Davis as that person. Angela Davis, of course, Black activist who, as you know, was a professor in California for a number of years, but also was an activist and did quite a lot of work. And actually was, for a long time, the only person people knew to be a member of the Communist Party. Actually, if you think of Angela Davis, now Claudia Jones would have been that person then. And that's a really important point. And I'm not saying this to diminish Angela, never, but because Angela also cites Claudia Jones specifically for this reason, because Claudia Jones is the first person to theoretically bring together woman, race, and class, which Angela Davis would be known for over the years. So Claudia does that. And there were other people who were thinking it through, but Claudia wrote about it. And a very important piece is identified, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman. That was the language they were using then, in which she talks about the need for a Black woman to be really centrally part of any kinds of analyses that we have. And the logic she gives is really an important one, because people like Kwame Nkrumah would use similar arguments. The logic is that once Black women move, the entire society moves. And why? Because Black women often experience that sort of triple subordination based on all of those reasons. Still, of course, if you look at salary scales for Black women, the pay scale for Black women is still among the lowest among all groups. And Claudia also writes about this in her own work. Develops a whole theory about how the Black woman's labor is super exploited, the super exploitation of the Black woman. So she is somebody who then in the 1940s and the 1950s is right at the center of articulating all of that. So your question was, how did somebody like me get a hold of her and really be so impacted by her? Because she was articulating a lot of the critical theoretical points that many of us still struggle to articulate. So that when you look at a Kamala Harris, for example, the woman who is now the vice president-elect, we see the sort of result of a number of decades of women organizing and thinking about why Black women need to be part of the political discussions wherever they are in the world.
I think we should mention that in 1955, Claudia Jones was deported to Britain because of the refusal of the authorities to allow her to adopt U.S. citizenship. Could you shed some light on that?
I can. The point is that Claudia came as a little girl of 8, and she joined the Communist Party when she was like 21. 18, she was in the Young Communist League. Now, why is that relevant? Any of you who have gone through U.S. naturalization processes, there are 2 questions that you are asked at the end of that list of questions. And those questions are, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Or do you know anybody? Or have you been in association with that? So basically, the fact that she joined the Communist Party that young precluded her, even though she married an American citizen, which is one of the avenues one has for acquiring citizenship. She was still denied it, but it was on those grounds. So this is why she ended up being deported, because she technically was still, in that time period, a British subject. She was a British subject. So when you look at her passport, that's how it's identified, as a British subject. So because of that, there were 2 options after a trial that she went through for having communist ideas. 2 options. One, she could be sent back to the Caribbean, or she could be sent to England. And they sent her to England. So she technically was deported to England, and they even letters in her file in communication with Dr. Eric Williams and so on. She met Chetty Jagan. In my book, if you look at Left of Karl Marx, you'll see photos of her with Chetty Jagan, with Norman Manley, with Jomo Kenyatta. Interestingly, she becomes, and as you know, London in that period was like the major site of a lot of Black political intellectual circulation. Martin Luther King Jr. passed through there. She met him. W.B. Du Bois passed through London when he was going to Ghana to retire fully. She met him. So what I'm trying to say is what I got from that book I mentioned earlier from Buzz Johnson was like a very minor version of what I discovered the more I did research, that this woman was really major. So major that she's buried to the left of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery. I was doing a job talk once at Cornell, and one of my colleagues who is prof there too said, how did she get to be buried left of Karl Marx? And I was like, okay, now we're talking. So basically, she is positioned, if you stand, and many people go there just to see this, if you stand facing the Marx bust, which is a towering monument in Highgate Cemetery, London, to the left of it on a flat stone is the identification of Claudia Jones being buried left of Karl Marx. But I use that as my title because I'm arguing boldly that she, because of her ability to articulate questions of race and gender in a way that Marx could not, she technically is left of him. When I mean by left, I don't mean more radical than, but I mean she allows Marxism to have a whole different kind of opening, a whole different kind of active movement outside of just the philosophizing of it, which many activists do with Marx. It becomes sort of like a dogmatic theorizing about Marx. But even on that same bust, there's a statement from Marx that says the philosophers of the world have analyzed the world. Now it's time to really do something about changing it. So she is that kind of change agent.
Just let's go back briefly to when Claudia Jones was deported to Britain. And when leaving America, she made a rather profound statement. Quote, "The special kind of reaction in its racist immigration laws, directed especially against West Indians, from whose proud heritage I spring, and also against Asiatic people, is the shame of America." Unquote. How profound.
Wow. And it's still relevant, isn't it? Because we're still experiencing that, which is a sad statement, isn't it? The more things change, as they say, right? She had a really good handle on that. And when I mentioned Kamala Harris in passing, and of course, people debate who she is and so on. But basically, one of the things that Claudia did, and Walter Rodney would do it as well, is say that as Black people, we cannot work with such a narrow understanding of questions of Black identity that leaves out collaboration or relationships with people who are of Indian descent. And in fact, Walter Rodney would define his Black would include Black and Indian people. And of course, there are a lot of interesting discussions about Kamala Harris's family as it relates to that combination. But the reason why I say that, Claudia would create a newspaper which would be called the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. Again, bringing together those two political identities, racial/cultural, ethnic identities as well in one place.
We talked about where she's buried, the left of Karl Marx. And at the funeral of Claudia Jones, the African National Congress, the ANC, their message read, quote, "World liberation loss. The death of Claudia Jones has deprived the liberation fighters all over the world of one of the most dynamic and most militant fighters. It is difficult to think of anyone in recent years who has remained so incorruptible in spite of the insidious influences of artificial independence. Claudia, as we knew her, belonged to the forefront of the struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and fascism."
Wow.
Wow is right. That's what I said when I read it.
When you read it, like, wow, what an amazing statement, right? I'm so glad you read that because it triggers so many things. And, you know, doing research, you read so many documents, but that's one piece that one is definitely worth coming back to. For example, Google London, and I doubt whether Google US would do it. Google UK did one of those Google Doodles for her. And there's a march that she's leading. In the last 2 years of her life, she dies in 1964, she was very involved with an organization called CACO. And it's actually just a Caribbean Afro-Asian organizations committee that was created to do that work. And one of the things they did was a lot of protesting and picketing the South African embassy for the release of Nelson Mandela. So this, you know, the ANC would have been very much involved with collaborative work with the ANC reps. Many of them were based in London, as you know. So she was actively doing that kind of work in London as well. And did parallel marches, like she did a parallel march of Washington as well. So she was the kind of person who, according to George Lamming, the writer, she would just come and tell him that this is what's coming up next, and she wanted him to be there, and he would be there. He said she was the kind of person that would just take you along with her to various activist kinds of organizations and structures that she was going after. So the ANC statement is appropriate.
We have been talking about Claudia Jones. Carole, you are currently the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters, an endowed chair named after the 9th president of Cornell University. Others include the Frantz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association and the Distinguished Africanist Award from the New York State African Studies Association. What has driven Carole Boyce Davies to the extent whereby she could not have been bypassed having such honors bestowed upon her?
Wow. You know, I finished my PhD quite young. So I met people who thought I was older than I was. They're like, wow, I thought you were older. So I think if you finish your degree earlier, as I did, I think I was like 28. Let me just say, all of this is good fortune, timing, and being in the right place at the right time. I was doing a degree at Howard, and I have to really thank Howard for that experience. So I was in Washington, D.C. doing a degree in African Studies. And at Howard at that time, everybody you wanted to meet as a Black intellectual was there. C.L.R. James was there. I would often sit in C.L.R. James' class with a guy I was dating. Sylvia Wynter, the famous theorist, came through as a guest of C.L.R. James' class. Leon Damas, one of the founders of the Negritude movement, was my thesis advisor. Elliot Skinner. There was a whole thing then, particularly at Howard, when in African Studies program that I came from, that had a collaboration with Columbia University, which brought all those profs from Columbia down to teach courses in the African Studies department at Howard. So that was my intellectual formation. And the reason why I say that, this is the mid-1970s. So I get a degree at Howard. And keep in mind that all the other major African-American literary exponents would also come through. Stokely Carmichael would lecture on campus in a very dashing style where all the young women were like just, so happy to see him and so on. So all of the major Black intellectuals and activists were coming through Howard at that time. So this is the place that I see then as, giving me all of the necessary motivation and preparation for taking my work in interesting directions. And then I finished my degree and I went home because I'm planning to go to join the Trinidadian Diplomatic Service. And I had to get clearance to fill out those applications and so on. And when I went to Trinidad, I saw in the newspaper scholarships to go to Nigeria to study African literature, which is what I was studying at Howard. So I filled out the application and then I went back to Howard and didn't think I would hear anything else. And then I got a phone call from the Trinidad embassy saying, oh, you were one of the people who got this scholarship, which turned out to be quite major. It was a Commonwealth scholarship, which paid every single thing, fees, travel, everything to Nigeria. So this is where I would do my African PhD with African and Caribbean literature at University of Ibadan, Nigeria, at a time again when many major scholars came through there. Birbal Singh from Guyana, Arthur Drayton as well from UWI. All kinds of intellectuals, Keith Warner would come through Ibadan when I was there. So I was often, again, exposed to a range of intellectuals. And so therefore, this is what I mean about timing and location and all of that. So after that, I would have to go back to Trinidad to work to fulfill my Commonwealth scholarship obligations. And then I came back to the US and have been working in the US pretty much ever since. Although I would, teach at UWI in Trinidad at one point, University of Brasilia on a Fulbright professorship, Beijing Foreign Studies University as a visiting prof, similar opportunities at Oxford University in England and so on. This is what I mean about good fortune, timing, location, preparation, and inspiration from people who really would often tell you, you can do anything, you can go forward. This is what I mean about being at Howard at that time. There was nothing that felt like a barrier that would say that you cannot do this. Almost everyone I spoke with and told I wanted to do something would say, oh, that's an amazing idea, do that. So I think just being located at the right time. But keep in mind, I come from a family where my aunt and my mother, they would be very much influenced by Garveyite Pan-Africanism. So I heard that growing up. Amy Ashwood Garvey came through the Caribbean, and I remember my aunt and my mother rushing out to go to a meeting where she was and so on. So yeah, family, preparation, Howard, and the ability to have that international experience very, very early, I think has been formative. So getting the endowed professorship at Cornell at this point, to me, it's a nice statement, but it's something that institutions kind of have a way of indicating to you at some point in your career that you've done enough work, therefore you're worthy of that kind of identification.
How has the pandemic crisis impacted your work at Cornell University?
I've had to teach via Zoom. It's kind of interesting in a way, and I'll give you two reasons why. One is that students are much more, this is a generation now that has come of age in universities where they've had to take courses online. So they're much more apt to be engaged. And some people have had the opposite example, but for me, they have been very, very engaged. And then relatedly, because, and I thought, and I've been saying this now in different kinds of ways, because we are from a global kind of community and know scholars from everywhere, in my teaching, I've been able to bring in scholars from the Caribbean into the classroom. So students have had writers, they've had, and I've talked to friends who I've said, would you come in and read your work in my class? And they were like, yeah. Because I guess, so the pandemic and the closure provided the technology, but also created a condition where people felt that they wanted to share their ideas and share their work. And I'm sure you've seen the proliferation of so many Zoom meetings and webinars and so on. So I want to encourage people, if you're doing any of this teaching, to definitely make sure that you include scholars from the global community that who are able then to find ways to come into your teaching and so on. So that's what I've been doing, teaching online and really enhancing my teaching by having a range of writers and visitors into the classroom from the continent and from the Caribbean.
Before we wrap up, tell us about Caribbean Space, the project that you're currently wallowing in, if I can use a terminology.
Right. I love that project for a number of reasons, right? I was trying to find a way to internationalize how we think about Caribbean culture. So it was my way of moving us away from the logic of just island geographies, because as you know, you come from Guyana, we therefore miss the surrounding continental locations, as well as the Caribbean cultural locations in North, South, and Central America, and then the Caribbean diaspora. So for me, I wanted to move us beyond sort of seeing the Caribbean only in terms of small space, but to see us looking at the Caribbean as a large, much larger international location. So certain areas of northern Brazil definitely fit that Caribbean paradigm. If you go to Colombia, for example, which Caribbean Studies was at last year, you would note that that entire coast of the Caribbean defines itself as Caribbean. So essentially, we limit ourselves if we just see this relationship to narrow island spaces, which is how they define Caribbeans all the time. That's so they would say, oh, you're from the islands. And then you would have to correct them and explain and all of that. So for me, the logic, and I use this interestingly, if people get a chance to look at that book, the fact that space is consistently expanding at the level of scientific understanding of what space is, there's a consistent expanding of the universe. And for me, one has to look at the Caribbean also in that paradigm. So every time you see a geological shift, and often it's horrendous because it's an earthquake or an impending volcano or something, we're still in the process of creation. And I learned from a really important scholar named John Figueroa that we cannot understand the Caribbean if we miss the in-between spaces. So we cannot also miss the fact that what is underneath is also part of Caribbean space and can also shift and be something else later on. So we have to see ourselves as fluid, as expanding, as global people, but also the fact that the Caribbean diaspora also expands Caribbean space. And wherever we are, wherever I am in Miami, and I know you in Tampa and so on, we create Caribbean space, we grow things. And there are people who talk about driving around places like in Miami and looking at all the ackee trees and knowing that that means that Caribbean people have been living in those neighborhoods. So essentially, the Caribbean space for me, or Caribbean spaces, refer to that sort of extended understanding of the Caribbean beyond island definitions, the in-between spaces as well, and also the circum-Caribbean and the surrounding locations that have those Caribbean extensions, and the Caribbean diaspora, critical. Brixton is Caribbean space. Brooklyn is Caribbean space. Miami for sure is Caribbean space. And there's so many others. We went to a place in Paris, and that whole area was like a Haitian community where you could get food and all of that. So I think the thing is that people, once we migrate, we then create these locations, which then bring our cultural locations into those connections, which then give us that expanded notion of Caribbean space.
Carole Boyce Davies, thank you for joining me here on the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast.
It's too short, Ron.
Yes, it is.
I was just getting warmed up.
Which means there'll have to be a part 2.
Okay, super. And I'm working on a book on Black women and political leadership in Africa and the diaspora, which is due at the press at the end of January.
How can one get in contact with you?
I'm available through Cornell University, CEB278 at cornell.edu. And then I have a website which has a lot of my books and information, caroleboycedavies.com. A lot of information is there as well, particularly interviews, and hopefully this one I will add to it. But people can go back and see some of the things I've done recently, particularly this past year. And also interesting links to Claudia Jones readings, Claudia Jones discussions, and so on that you will find.
Again, I thank you.
I thank you, Ron, for having me.
Thank you for spending some time with us. If you are so inclined, you can subscribe to these podcasts and donate to them by clicking on the Support the Show button on the website. Please continue to protect yourself and your loved ones during this global pandemic by observing all protocols. Be safe, be strong, and be aware. I'm Ron Bobb-Semple.